Today, I'm delighted to welcome Margaret O'Connor, who is an entrepreneur, a tech investment fund chair, and experienced NED. Margaret is chair of Launch Africa Venture Fund and Pay Today. She sits on the investment committee of 535 Venture Fund and has recently become a non-executive of Chrysalis through New Role. She was also the successful founder of the news market, which she took from a $0 to $100 million Series A valuation. And earlier in her career, she spent time at MasterCard and was a propaganda advisor at the Ministry of Finance for South Korea. Margaret, a huge welcome to you, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to New Role for helping me find a really interesting independent position with a disruptive tech investment fund in the UK.
Fantastic. Well, Margaret, I'd love to start talking a little bit about your experience as a founder. It sounds like an amazing story, and I'd love to hear about what value you got from your board as a founder.
Thanks. Yes, the whole experience of starting and scaling and eventually selling our tech startup, a lot of the success can be attributed to a strong board. So from the angel stage, we had people with high conviction in the power of our disruptive technology who provided some patient capital to help us hire the right leadership team to grow our B2B revenue across the US, Europe, and Asia. And at the appropriate inflection point in our growth, to help introduce us to Tier 1 Silicon Valley VC, Ellen Patricoff, a legend, again, really smart, patient capital, extremely appropriate governance for each life stage of the company. And with Ellen Patricoff's support, we then were able to attract investment from Hearst Ventures, so strategic media fund, and later on from SoftBank. So, increasing levels of rigor on the board as the company progressed through its financial journey and its life stage and its global growth. The type of value that the board provided, of course, evolved as the company moved through these life stage. So initially, it was really helping the management team evaluate strategic commercial trade-offs. We were trying to do everything all at once with a very lean, mean team. So to help us focus on what were the appropriate KPIs for a given month, not even quarterly, really holding us to account month to month until we achieve certain milestones. And certainly our board was extremely important in helping access the right smart money, as I outlined earlier. They also were, this being a founder is a really 24/7 job. There's a lot of founder burnout risk. As a board member, I'm always looking for making sure that the founders are practicing some self-love and self-care so that they can sustain themselves for this super marathon. So, we found with the board that we had a balance of tough love and the occasional hugs and just the guidance about sustaining ourselves over time.
That sounds fantastic. And can you remember specific moments on that journey that really stood out for you, where an individual board member stood in and helped and added particular value?
Oh, there's just so many. I think it was probably, I mean, one of the really crucial moments was a board member making a call to a really important enterprise customer, and opening that door at the most senior level of the organization. It would have taken us founders 2 years of proof of concepts to, access a C-suite executive who had the potential to unlock really significant revenue for the company. So that was an incredibly useful and valuable access to network that the board member provided once that they were completely confident that we had the ability to implement on time, on budget, and exceed expectations.
Fantastic. And was your board all investor directors, or did you have independent directors as well?
That board was invested people linked to investment. We did not seek other
And
independents.
how did you feel that dynamic worked? Did you feel that the investor directors were always fully aligned with your mission, or were there times when you felt like you were pulling in different directions?
Later stage in the company's growth, that became an issue. And it's really the financial return on investment horizon. Working in disruptive technology, you obviously need to invest up front before you can harness this commercial return on investment. And that we did have one investor director who was not aligned with the management team and some of the other investors, and that became extremely uncomfortable and required some arbitration.
Wow, fantastic. Okay, I'd love to dig more into that. How did you manage to sort of resolve that? What was the arbitration process?
Well, everyone really, was aligned in the mission of the organization. So it was coming back to first principles and why are we in this, and getting aligned on the timelines, and really helping the investor director understand that they would reach their commercial returns, but it just needed to be aligned with the natural progression of this business and our ability to unlock those revenues to pay them
Got it.
back.
And who was playing the chair role, and how did that help?
Very seasoned investor who had been through this many times before. So really brought calm to the proceedings and didn't get emotionally involved, and yeah, just lowered the temperature. And I mean, this was true both as on the board as a founder, but also on the MasterCard Asia Pacific board. I had really good role modeling of how you can manage board preparation before difficult meetings, and having some of those offline conversations and ensuring an appropriate level of preparedness for every member of the board, and understanding what might be some of each board member's hot buttons, and again ensuring that they were fully up to speed with the strategic issues at
Got it.
hand.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I'd love to expand out from that experience as a founder to your experience now more broadly as a chair and non-executive. How have the best boards you've worked with, and also as an executive, added the most value? What have you since learned from your experience of sitting on the other side of the table?
Yeah, so throughout my life in fintech, I found the boards have been extremely useful, both as a non-exec and an investor. Board members have been really helpful on the regulatory compliance side. In fintech, many companies are operating where the regs haven't caught up with the tech and market adoption. So, and again, depending on the life stage of the company and the jurisdiction in which they're operating, to understand how much we need to go slow or there was freedom to go fast, and also to figure out who, not necessarily on the board, but who in the ecosystem needed to educate the regulators. So we started, the conversation talking about MasterCard and Visa. When I was a MasterCard exec, MasterCard played a really important role in helping to educate the regulator through MasterCard University and inviting central bankers to our annual general meeting. And I've brought that ethos of looking at the regulator as an enabler in digital transformation, and making sure that we found champions within the central bank and other regulatory authorities who are given the opportunity to engage with the private sector, not about the merits of a particular technology, but more generally in what's happening, because obviously the tech is moving so fast and regulators don't always have the capability to catch up with independent research. These days, I'm finding that really important in the blockchain space. So in the UK, I think there's fantastic systems in place where the regulator and the private sector and interested academics have the ability to work together on sandboxes, and there's thorough communication and sharing of insights. The same would be true in Singapore. and to a lesser extent in South Africa. Those are some of the markets in which I currently operate. But it's really as a board member ensuring that the founders don't get too far ahead of the regulation and that there's this willingness to learn from the public sector. Um, Other lessons from my founding days or previous management that I've brought into my non-exec roles today, it's ensuring that the board understands that they need to bring the management team along when they're challenging them about a potential strategic pivot or expand, international expansion, cross-border expansion, the consequences of that. Some board members are impatient and they think they know the answer and they'll rush to a resolution that hasn't really allowed the management team to weigh in about why they may have a counter argument or refusal to pivot a strategy or some disagreement about international expansion or disagreement about potential investors in the company. But it's really to get over that impatience and to remain open to the point of view of the management team because they're the ones who are actually going to have to implement the strategy.
And what does that mean in practical terms? Is there an example you could maybe share with us and talk us through practically what that actually involves?
Yes. So when I said before, you know, board meetings, you obviously there's a lot of time tension, right? We generally have an aggressive agenda to get through in a short period of time, and there's a lot of uh, financial value locked up in that meeting. But as I said earlier, certain board members may have something to offer the management team or need to work through an issue. So it doesn't have to be in the board meeting, but having some of those preparatory calls or meetings where you know that there's some blockage in the system and can you spend time, frank conversation, strategic trade-offs, and getting to a healthy board debate where we can agree together on the strategy, but having appropriate consultation and time to mull over some options. And sometimes that means putting off a resolution to a future date. On the other hand, I have a board that continuously kicks decisions down the line, and that's also not healthy. So being realistic about when on the calendar year do you need to make this decision and ensure that the management and board are listening to each other and learning from each other and ultimately getting to the decision that represents the best financial results for the company and also management cohesion.
Got it. Okay. And how do you think now about the having independent directors on your boards versus investor director question?
I think extremely important um, for later stage companies. Um, and the board composition in terms of the ultimate or appropriate number of directors, I think also depends on the sector and the life stage of the company. As a consultant, I used to do digital transformation training for listed financial institutions and would walk into a boardroom with 12 to 15 board members. Who's making the decision here? Like in many cases, this was too big for an effective organization that needed to evaluate very complicated decisions. Subcommittees had an important role to play. Um, as a founder, right, we had a very small board, 4 or 5 people that grew as we had bigger institutional investors. So board size, I think, is super important. Independent directors, obviously, when you move beyond 3 or 4 into 7, then to have independent directors who also probably provide gender diversity, race diversity, and generational diversity. In many cases, investor directors are on the mid to late stage in their careers, and in some, again, working largely in disruptive tech companies, sometimes there's merit in having a director, independent director, who's more closely a digital native, who's more closely aligned to the product evolution life cycle of this technology, particularly if it's consumer facing. Um, on the other hand, you also may want the maturity of a very seasoned independent director who's been through several financial cycles and technology life cycles and bring the wisdom of age and can see the evolution of the sector over many years. So, the generational composition I think is also important. And that's obviously not legislated, right? Like in the UK, you have
Yeah, super interesting.
the policy guidelines to ensure gender diversity and increasingly now racial diversity, which is great. But then this, unspoken question about age.
Absolutely. No, I think it's we've seen members, organizations on the Neural platform, big listed companies end up hiring, millennials when the chair of the boards when they first saw these candidates coming through, they're like, these people are far too young. Why are you showing us these people? And then as they dug down into their experience, often they were from a digital background. They said, well, they had a huge functional insight, but actually, 80% of our stakeholders are employees, our customers, our suppliers are millennials, and the average age around this board table is sort of 60 plus.
Yep.
We have no one providing that millennial perspective. We've got to have this. So we're starting to see more of that, which is very interesting.
I'm really glad you brought up the employee insight piece of it because I was really coming at it from a consumer perspective, but it, employee satisfaction and retention of talent is clearly a key challenge for many knowledge economy corporations. So, very good point. And I guess in emerging markets, we saw a lot of junior boards with millennials, but I think it's absolutely appropriate that some of that millennial leadership be at the main board level.
Fantastic. And one of the other trends we observe is there is this huge pressure on boards right now to improve their diversity, but it primarily happens at the listed company space, in government and not-for-profit organizations. We don't see it so much at the startup level, and I think there's a sort of different dynamic at work. But I'd be really interested to understand how you've seen diversity or lack of it play out in startup boards. Are there some tangible examples you can point to where you've seen either the benefit or the cost of a lack of diversity?
I referred to the tough love and occasional hugs as a founder, and I can draw a straight line to the women on the board and the people who understood that it wasn't always about beating up the management team. And so I try and take that sensibility into my tech investment fund roles and ensure that all of the boards of our portfolio companies have board members who are looking, not just who can raise their head above the spreadsheet, and looking at the talent management and retention and the human dynamic of the founders. The other thing about the human dynamic of the founders and startup management, we all know that some founders are not the right people to take a company through to late stage, growth investment and potential IPO or trade sale. And so really having board members, and this is sometimes easier for independent, non-financial directors to assess if we have co-founders, 2 or 3 managers who started the company together, are they the right people? Do we need to change the mix in that founding management team? If it's the right people who have the scope to change and grow and evolve and become more systems people to scale, a company in its home market and beyond. Do we offer them the right mix of professional training and development and mentoring to ensure that they are appropriately skilled and resourced to manage this transition across the different life stages of the company?
Super interesting. Yeah, it resonates a lot. I mean, I previously was an investor, and I used to spend 80% of my time focused on the numbers, and I, hope I wasn't completely EQ dead on the investor spectrum. Whereas now, as an operator, I spend 80% of my time focused on the people. And I know if I get the people right, the numbers will take care of themselves. And I sometimes, I think back to times when, as an investor, we were sitting around the table, with the board table, all of us investors, and none of us with any actual operational experience. And it goes back to that sort of diversity of thought. You can get very narrow in your thinking.
Right. And again, to the independent directors, I also look for um, people with operating experience, right, who've been through this and can have empathy and understand the peaks and troughs in the cycle of the business. Um, the other thing about looking at, being a captive to the spreadsheet, often those numbers are based on historical market data, and spending most of my time in the disruptive tech investment space, we don't have the data about where a lot of these companies are going, and we're having to make this up as we go along. So, you obviously need the spreadsheet to understand, based on our current understanding of the market opportunity, when is the J curve going to really lift off? But we have to lift our head from the spreadsheet and constantly check in with market realities, competitors coming from nowhere, right? Opportunity for M&A that didn't exist a year ago. So it's constantly changing, and obviously you need to be able to feed some of that information back into the spreadsheet. And as an emerging markets investor, we find that a lot of that data on private market performance and comparables is not widely available. So this, for me, has been, just a real aha as chairman of Launch Africa Venture Fund, that as an investor in 85 disruptive tech companies in 17 countries, we are sitting on a gold mine of data about the ecosystem that doesn't exist anywhere, right? Different story in the UK. There's a lot more transparency of data. So it's understanding in your spreadsheet, is this accurately assessing our performance and the market opportunity right now and
And
tomorrow?
I want to shift a little bit to talk about a different topic, which has always interested me, which is risk. And on the board, you sometimes see boards that go through sort of box ticking exercises on risk. And actually, when you dig under the surface and what's happening in the company level, there's not engagement with it, and there's this sort of siloed thinking. How do you think about managing risk on your boards?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So, I talked about regulatory risk. That's a real issue, and particularly when the regulatory regime is still evolving. Implementation risk is one of the hardest ones to get right. Um, Back to the burnout and the motivations of the founders, and their ability to execute against the plan at the different life stages. The financial risk, I think, is generally well covered by most boards. I don't see that as a problem. At Chrysalis, I was given the opportunity to lead their ESG strategy. So it's been really interesting to look at, human capital management, the evolution in tech. What are the norms in different countries and cultures and tech verticals, and ensuring, how do we then translate that into due diligence on our current and potential investments. And then obviously climate finance and climate change is such a hugely important risk that is, becoming increasingly important to institutional investors in the UK and around the world. And there's a lot of need for coming together about what are the right metrics for different life stages of companies in climate finance and climate risk mitigation. So this is an area where I think um, the UK, many stakeholders that we found in the sustainability space, law, the KPMG, the professional services. I see a lot of exchange of information and public-private sector cooperation and nonprofits coming into the conversation. So I think it's a super exciting time in terms of climate change, risk management, and what does it mean for both public and private
Got it.
companies.
Picking up on your earlier around sort of well-being and the risk around that, that for me has been one of the game changers coming into this sort of startup environment. We use a people analytics platform that gathers data on a weekly basis from people on how they're feeling, aggregates it, anonymizes it, and so you can start to pinpoint where your pain points are as an organization. And it sort of made me think, gosh, back as I was sitting on boards as an investor, I relied, almost exclusively on the executive narrative, and then occasionally
Mm,
doing deep dives and trying to get into the company. But how do you think about managing that particular risk of looking around the corner on the sort of people? So many organizations say people are our most important asset, and yet they have very little visibility on, in a data sense at least, on how the people are feeling and how they're performing.
sure.
How do you think about
Well, I'd love to learn more about the assessment that you're currently doing. One of the tech companies in which we're invested is a pioneer in behavior tech. So looking at nonverbal cues about stress and satisfaction, super fascinating space. They really got started looking. They were invited into some pharmaceutical and health market research trials just to, again, get very difficult information through behavior tech. So, I think it's also walking the floors, right? And I've asked this as a non-executive director to have management take us, take interested members of the board into the organization on unplanned um, excursions. And that will obviously give you some real insights into how people are interacting and a sense check as to, yeah, the environment. And one company going into front office, back office, if it's manufacturing, the factory floor, I think it's super important for members of the board to occasionally dip their toe into the organization, see for themselves.
Brilliant. And then McKinsey recently released a report, which I thought was interesting, drawing a link between the experience of veterans returning from the theatre of war to what organizations are facing now post 2 years of COVID and
Mm.
coming back to work and getting over that hump. How
Hmm.
are you thinking on your sort of on the boards that you sit on about the people and getting them over that return post COVID?
Yep. No, that's really interesting. The the uh, the boards on which I sit, the employees, as I understand it, for the most part, are welcoming at least a hybrid return to work because in the creative part of their jobs, the collaboration in real life is so much more powerful and effective face to face. Now that doesn't require 5 days a week face to face. So I've seen most organizations try and chart different functions and when do we need to have relevant members of the team together in the same space. Um, in the tech world, uh, everywhere in the worlds I work, I'm seeing hybrid work. I'm not seeing organizations require 100% return to physical work. And in the war for talent with scarce skills, I think honoring people's wishes about how they feel they can contribute most effectively to the organization is super
Okay,
important.
that makes a lot of sense.
But I wanted to bring up when you said war, McKinsey in the survey about going back to work after war. When this goes back to the IP question, what one of the most instructive when I talked about IP was working with the former head of the Pentagon, right? So so I've had the opportunity to work with people who have been on the front lines of war and then tried to take those insights of managing men and women who put their lives at risk every day into business. And, VUCA, vulnerability, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. We created a VUCA index, which is taking what the general learned from Afghanistan and translating that for business executives in the US, Europe, and Africa. And that goes back to the cultural norms. It's like taking these same algorithms and absolutely needing to tweak what is relatively normal and what does vulnerability feel like in these different sectors, geographies.
How fascinating. So tell me more. Can you expand on that practically, like how that played out?
Sure. But just this idea of VUCA and business, right? So the U.S. military clearly has an incredible research and development budget and understands the impact of stress on soldiers and their leaders, and equipping the leaders with some tools to help understand different battalions and units, the relative vulnerability they face, and how do we deploy those resources effectively today. We have incomplete data sets, and this is life or death, right? Very few businesses I work in are life and death
Sure.
every day. So it's taking that extreme VUCA and saying, okay, well, what can we learn about resource deployment and people management when we have incomplete data sets, right? And that goes back to our spreadsheet analysis where we're like, in the world of emerging technology, we're making best guesses about what are the threats we face right now. But if we take this like military VUCA analysis, and again, commercial trade-offs, how do we use our people most effectively and deploy them differently, maybe in different geographies, and sometimes give them time to rest, and sometimes give them time to think, and sometimes, as we were saying, time to celebrate and be together, quiet. When do we need to go in on the attack?
Okay. I'd like to sort of talk about a different topic around board
Mm-hmm.
performance. One of the things that has always struck me, one of the sectors I used to invest in was
Okay.
education, and so I've always sort of spent a lot of time thinking about growth mindset, improvement, and it strikes me that often boards are sort of slow to think about their own ongoing sort of education and
Yep.
performance. What's your experience of that, and how do you assess your board's performance?
I love that question. So I had the privilege when I joined the Pay Today board of working. So this was a long established board, and I was the first independent director and chair. And coming up with the process to create board KPIs. So having common KPIs across the board about strategic vision and values, and then playing to the strengths of each board member, where they had unique KPIs, whether it's linked to the strategic investor they represented, or myself responsible for the education and development of these board members coming from incumbent organizations about emerging technology, cyber risk management, all of this kind of stuff that wasn't in their day jobs. So, in terms of educating board members, what I found to be effective is a mix of solutions. Um, we sometimes have independent experts come in as a guest, to do a workshop or an expert lecture Q&A on a topic. We sometimes send board members onto executive education programs. Those could be 6 to 12 weeks or shorter even, on a topic that is of crucial strategic importance to the organization. Board retreats, which could be a half day or 2 days, where we work together on an area, again, in disruptive technology or human capital management. I can imagine in the next year or two, we were talking earlier about climate risk mitigation and climate finance. I can completely imagine some interested members of the Chrysalis board joining me on some of this professional training and development, together with our expert advisor on ESG. Um, but yeah, and then of course there's podcasts. So that's like mini MBAs, right? And digital training that people can pursue. So one of my areas of research and development now is cyber risk management strategies. So I've kind of created my own um, pathway, reaching out to subject experts who are looking at cyber risk management for boards and organizations. And we have investments in cybersecurity companies. So again, speaking to some of their subject experts about the emerging technologies, global best practices, the human capital management side of it, because right in
Hmm.
cyber risk, people are, it's, we use all this technology, but often it comes down to human factors. So having both tech and human factors interacting. So yeah, it's, I think some of it is self-directed and some of it can be really useful and informative to have the group come together and share in a learning experience. Right. I introduced this topic of board KPIs. I haven't generally um, had I haven't inherited those when I joined most organizations. I don't think that's a
And
norm.
do you have a standard set of KPIs that you use that go across every board, or are they tailored to each board?
No, 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 not at all. Not at all. I think it's really, unique to the organization and obviously taking the management's KPIs into consideration in the life stage of the
So can you
company.
give me an example of what a set of KPIs you use on one of your boards is? What do they look like, and how do you measure them?
Um, sure. And so as you would know as an investor, the financial measurement KPIs, are very straightforward. The communication, listening, and human capital management are much harder to measure and evaluate. So thus, I'm interested in what you were saying earlier about the assessment of organizations. Um, what are the other management? And then for the fintech that I mentioned, one of my KPIs is on the capital structure of the company, right? So that's evolving and cross-border growth. That was one of the challenges that I faced coming into the company. So, it's really dependent on the commercial strategy of the organization and to what extent the board can and should influence it, right? In an early stage company, the board can play a more activist role. In a listed company, the board is really there to guide, not to roll up their sleeves.
Got it.
So it should be appropriate.
And I suppose, in your sort of executive career, you would have gone through sort of 360-degree reviews, and often, I guess, sort of the old way of doing that would have been at the end of the year, people would provide feedback on what you've done in the last 3 months and forget what had happened in the last 9 months. And increasingly, I think sort of forward-thinking organizations are moving to continuous development models. My experience of boards is very few have that sort of review process in place. And I see a lot of founders who get into trouble where they've got, either a chair or a board member who's underperforming and they don't have any sort of performance management system in place in order to be able to get them out in a non-confrontational way. How do you think about managing the performance?
No, yeah, no, certainly the 360 reviews do exist in the listed company board that I have joined, and I thought that was super healthy. It's on an annual cadence, but it is anonymous, and the company takes it seriously. And I think it is a healthy process to go
And what
through.
about in the startup space? Because often startups are more sort of resource constrained. Is that
Yes,
realistic? And
I think it's completely realistic and relevant. It's just a matter of making time to do it and having the discipline to follow through if the 360 unearths problem areas, particularly when the board is packed with investor directors.
yes, yeah, exactly. So how do you handle that if you've got, I don't know if you've had that experience where you've had a problematic investor director who's not adding value to the board. What have you how have you handled that?
So uh, in our case, we went to the general partners of the VC firm and asked for a review of the board representation, and obviously had a lot of documentation as to what had transpired and what we were looking for in terms of specific deliverables and board KPIs. So it was just the wrong person from the organization. The VC got it right, and it was a very successful and happy, growth experience from there. But as you know, sometimes you just have the wrong person, or or the wrong KPI, or their KPIs of the organization don't match the time commitment required on the
Yep.
board. So I think the time issue is a super big issue on early, both early stage and growth stage companies. And sometimes it's better to have um, an investor director who doesn't have as many demands on his or her time, and who can give appropriate time to the role. Sometimes it's better to have that person who is on multiple boards, super busy, and can snap help to make a decision. So again, it's really, depending on the composition of the board and the commercial factors affecting challenging the company to figure out that appropriate resource allocation from the investor director.
And just picking up on that sort of time element, what are the sort of most common mistakes, maybe three most common mistakes you see people making in the boardroom?
Time horizons. I talked about that as a founder, ensuring that the board members understand the appropriate requirement of their time and when the company are going to realize these financial, regulatory, human capital development, ESG milestones. It's just realism. Um, what else? Data. We talked about his problems with the spreadsheets and historical data not accurately representing the current market reality or the
Mm-hmm.
future market opportunity. So having board members who are alert to the possibilities of opportunistic deals or pivots or changing the flow of investment resources to attack an emerging opportunity or M&A opportunity. But it's just, again, back to the VUCA, when you have incomplete data sets, do you have people on the board who can source private market data or comparable data to help make data informed decisions that support our strategy or a switch in strategy because the market has moved?
You talked about one of your lessons learned as the need to invest appropriately in intellectual property protection. Can you talk more about that? It sounds fascinating.
Sure. So, working in disruptive tech investment, we see some amazing ideas come out of universities, right, all over the world. And one of the things I see in the university ecosystem is an obsession with patents and do these academics have the right to commercialize their ideas in the lab and who owns what. So anyway, I'm going with protection and motivations for people to commercialize emerging technology and ensuring that if you're going to invest in patents early in the life cycle of a company, to be fairly have high conviction that you're going to achieve product market fit, right? Because some companies overinvest in the IP protection up front before they've established if in fact we're going to have product market fit. As a founder, worked in a completely cutting edge video technology compression situation where we didn't get patent protection. We were moving so fast on customer adoption and it was fine, right? No one was trying to rip off our technology. Our customers were paying us appropriately for helping to adopt this in a commercial way, and it was all good. And then I talked about the VUCA index. It was a really uncomfortable IP situation where there was some, IP protection in the home market, but as we looked to expanding it internationally, it was really unclear as to who was going to own what and how to compensate the different stakeholders. And in all honesty, it was a situation where I decided to walk away from the product development and the financial upside, having invested a number of months in developing the algorithm for different markets and invested a lot of human capital in bringing other people into the project. It was just like, okay, this IP protection is really not clear. And I just feel really uncomfortable that this could go wrong. So I think that was really my trigger was moving into a disruptive tech investment fund with really mature companies. I'm highly confident of all the companies that I look at in that basket that they have absolutely appropriate IP protection at that life stage in the company. But it's the early stage is getting the balance right between IP protection, product market fit.
Yeah, no, it's one sort of we often wrestle with, and we sort of take the view that if you move fast, that's your sort of best form of protection. Unless you're in particularly technical area, and then always the risk of filing the patent as you're sharing your magic ingredients out there. So
Exactly,
another topic I'd
exactly.
love to get your thoughts on is around how you go about setting strategies. Again, my experience is often organizations sort of set these wonderful strategies, and this is all the way from sort of startups all the way through. And after a period of time, I think it was Mike Tyson once said, "Everyone has a plan until I punch them in the face." But also that the strategies are well understood at that board level, but if you go and ask the person on the shop floor, what's the strategy, they have no real understanding of what the organization is trying to achieve. What's your approach to ensuring that it's sort of followed through on and understood?
I love the example you offered about the disconnect between the C-suite and the board and the shop floor. And again, back to my point about walking the floor and having some direct contact with employees beyond the C-suite and the board representatives is really important to understanding this translation of high-level strategy into implementation across the organization. So, on the board level, we see that disconnect when you see data about turnover or challenges recruiting and retaining talent, right? That's the first indicator that there's this disconnect and the strategy is not getting through or it's the wrong strategy. And then of course, when or startups that are scaling up or scale ups that are going towards an IPO or a trade sale, if we're not attracting the right follow-on investors, sure sign to dig into the strategy. Has this technology passed its sell by date? Do we have the right leadership team driving the company to the next level of growth? Who are the other competitors who are coming into the market that might be stealing some of our thunder or grabbing the investment capital that we hope to
And
secure?
again, I mean, one of the other things that I've often wrestled with strategy is, you know, one of my favorite books is called The Seven Powers, which talks the moats that organizations can build and effectively identifies
Mm-hmm.
seven moats that any organization can head towards, whether that's brand or network effects or operational processes, whatever they might be. And then you have
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Mm-hmm.
goals for the year, whether they're sort of set up as wigs in a 4DX type setup or OKRs, sort of Andy Grove style. I find that organizations often some, when they're talking about strategy, are talking about the moats, and some are talking about the goals for the year. Kind of reconcile those two, the sort of the longer term objectives of how will you win when someone else comes in and works just as hard as you, versus the what do we need to get done this year.
Well, I guess I look for the moats up front, and if they aren't tall enough and deep enough, how do we get them established now and align those 12-month strategy cycles around that moat protection? And we've spoken a lot about how quickly the market may move and those moats may no longer be relevant, right? Like I'm thinking of drones, right? Like you have this, but now they can fly over. So it's always being alert, even when you think you have a completely valuable, impenetrable moat, to be alert to to the possibility that that may no longer be relevant. So it's right. You need to do this in the metaverse in multiple horizontal and vertical axes that you have clear enough KPIs, goals, and ambitions for a measurable period of time, and this assessment of you know the moats and are we building the right ones? Are we maintaining the right ones? Do we need to change our strategy there?
And how do you think about getting that balance right between, again, it's that sort of top down strategy and giving individuals on the shop floor the sense of autonomy that they're owning their direction as a board? How do you ensure that the organizations where you sit on the board are delivering on that?
Going back to the shop floor, many people on the ground, not necessarily the factory, but on the ground level and the digital natives without all the power, they're usually the first ones to know whether we have the right moat and what's changing, right? So to empower them as the early signaling force that we have a problem or we need to assess our moat strategy. They the rank and file, I think, all need to be unified about this kind of the 12-month cycle of KPIs, but they must be empowered, obviously. Early warning, 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 warning. This mode ain't gonna save my life.
And
So
so practically, how do you give them the, I guess, psychological safety to, or means to elevate that
right.
to the board level? Is it the walking the shop floor? Is it?
Well, I mean that's obviously one, but I think it's also thinking about technology and people. Technology is having transparency in intranets and digital communications, town hall meetings. God bless that innovation, right? Where anyone in the organization can raise an issue or concern or recommendation. That's probably the single easiest way. So if you have a corporate culture or organization culture that really tolerates that kind of um, in, integrity and interrogation from anyone in the organization to speak their mind, and obviously, there's lots of repercussions. Many organizations that I've worked with as an investor and as a consultant where the junior people are like, no, it would be career suicide to say something that they know is true about we have the wrong moat. So as a board member, I'm always working with the management team to ensure that they build in those systems to allow early warning, whether it's from customers, right? We haven't spoken enough about customers, employees, customers, investors, board members, right? You need to constantly monitor these inputs, but not to go crazy and pivot before. Like you're right, you also need to stay your course and know where you're going and know what the milestones are. So it's a constant dance. The other system that I've seen work well, when we back to the kind of, are we defending the right mode or are we pursuing, yeah, is corporate innovation systems or business innovation systems, right? Where you have either recognition and or financial rewards to employees for figuring out something of great strategic importance. So I think that's a tool that can be effective in big and small organizations.
Last question before we go on to the quick fire. What are three things you know now about sitting on a board that you wish you'd known when you first became a non-executive director? So, imagine you're sitting talking to someone who's taking on their first board role, giving them advice.
Patience, right? As an executive, I was rewarded for really rapid 24/7 action, and as a board member to be more contemplative and allowing your peers to come up to speed on certain issues. So patience is number one. Um, Linked to that is listening, right? It's as a board member, active listening in the meeting, in the preparation to the marketplace. Much more important usually than what you have to say is learning to train yourself for active listening and listening for information or insights
Mm-hmm.
that don't reinforce your point of view, right? So really being open to being challenged about getting out of your comfort zone. And number three, we were talking about diversity, and I said as a founder, we just had the financial directors, so this incredible value in having a range of voices around the board table responsible for strategy and holding the management accountable. So real celebration, as we were talking about earlier, with gender diversity, racial diversity, and generational diversity, financial skills, legal skills, regulatory insights, product and employee insights, right? So it's like, how do you find the right number of people who represent some of these different diversity and inclusion insights to really help this board hum and safeguard the commercial and non-financial impact metrics of the organization, whatever, public, private, startup, listed company.
What are the tools or methods that you do to really engage in that opening listening? Do you have?
Well, two that come to mind. One, active listening. I sometimes find myself either in a notebook or transcribe some of what I'm hearing so that I'm really, because I'm a visual learner, so that helps me to capture what I hear and again, force me to actively listen and try and, get the nuance of what someone else is saying. I also meditate every morning and, clearing some of the clutter in my head helps with active listening and patience and to understand, what battles do I feel I need to fight for and, otherwise to engage and to provide. Yeah, I just meditation is super important tool for everyone of all ages.
Amazing. It's one I need to get onto. I've not yet mastered that one.
5 minutes. It only takes 5 minutes. 11 minutes best, but 5 minutes is a good start.
So you've inspired me to give it another go. I've never managed to sustain it every time I've tried.
You just stare at your nose and close your eyes. It doesn't require you be anywhere special. You just be wherever you are.
Okay, great. So we're going to wrap up with a quick 5-question quick fire. The first question is, what's the book that has most influenced your thinking as a board member?
So I did look at your questions and I looked at my bookshelf. So Anthrovision by Gillian Tett. Um, so again, it goes to our diversity and listening. And the opening line is the last thing a fish would ever notice would be the watcher, right? So back to, obvious questions and data and stuff right under your nose. So yeah, Anthrovision, really, really useful book.
Amazing. I've not read that one. I will add it to my list. Your favorite quote?
My mother used to always tell me when I started my global career, pack less stuff and bring more money.
Your favorite holiday ever?
Cycling with my best girlfriends in the world. So this is something we would do every other year. We started doing it in rural China, and we pick a destination that we all want to visit. And we're all really competitive people, and we learn to ride at a steady pace, stop and smell the flowers, and enjoy a prosecco or a gelato or some other reward when we get to the top of the hill. And it's just cycling for me is freedom, and to share this kind of sense of freedom and discovery with some of my best friends in the world is always really good for the soul and really soothing and inspiring.
And is there one particular location that has surpassed the others?
Um, yes, Portugal. So it was the beginning of the European Union investing in cycle paths in Portugal, and there are many places along the route where the bike route just stopped. So we had to, we took turns figuring out who was going to be the trailblazer, and it was a really interesting experience. And I can report, having gone back to Portugal during some of the COVID lockdown, that the government has invested appropriately in adventure tourism, and these routes now are properly marked.
Amazing. Your favorite app?
Okay, little product placement. Starling, which happens to be one of the stars in the Chrysalis portfolio, but having spent a lot of my career in fintech and digital information, to find a retail bank doing everything I ever dreamed about for the past 30 years and putting that power of financial management in your fingertips, both for retail customers and small businesses. And the fact that in the app, the organization is so open to product innovation and customer feedback. And I really know that it's getting better every day because of this, not just the data analytics, but this genuine engagement with customers.
Fantastic. And last one, your best financial investment idea?
Well, I'm going to speak about my own financial investment. It was not for finance, but it turned out to be the smartest investment we made as a family. Was buying a beach house in Cape Town 20 something years ago when I lived in New York City. And it was not for financial returns that we bought it, but having just spent the Christmas holiday there and getting in crazy unsolicited offers to buy, it was an investment in my sanity and family togetherness and many happy memories and experiences with friends and business associates. And it's turned out to be a pretty smart real estate investment as well.
Wow, fantastic. Margaret, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and so fascinating getting the benefit of all your insights. I really appreciate it.